I speak today not as a man intoxicated by authority, not as someone seduced by uniforms, medals, or titles, but as a servant of responsibility. Because history has taught me something brutal and unavoidable. Leadership is not measured by how loudly you speak, how many follow you, or how long your name remains on walls, but by how deeply your conscience fears Allah and how honestly you stand before the truth when no crowd is watching. And when I look back through the pages of history, when I reflect on figures who carried power without being corrupted by it, one name rises like a mountain that time itself has failed to erode. Umar ibn al-Khattab, a man who ruled not from palaces but from accountability, who walked the streets at night not to be seen but to see, who feared injustice more than enemies and trembled at the thought that even a hungry animal might testify against him on the day of judgment. And I ask myself, and I ask every leader alive today, what happened to that kind of leadership? Because Umar did not inherit greatness. He was shaped by truth, molded by discipline, and anchored by taqwa. And when Islam entered his heart, it did not make him arrogant. It broke him into humility. And that is the first lesson history teaches us, that real leadership begins when ego dies, because Umar understood something many rulers forget. Power is not ownership. It is trust, amanah, and a trust is not celebrated. It is carried with fear. And when he said that if a mule stumbled on the road, he feared Allah would ask him why he'd not fixed the path, that was not poetry, that was accountability internalized so deeply that governance became worship. And today when I look at the modern world, when I look at presidents, generals, prime ministers, and kings, I see systems obsessed with image and survival, not justice and responsibility, and leadership has been reduced to strategy. Without morality, authority without humility, and strength without restraint. But Umar's strength was not in crushing dissent. It was in submitting himself to the law before anyone else. And history records that when a woman corrected him publicly, he did not silence her. He accepted truth, because a leader who cannot be corrected is already defeated. And this is where modern leadership collapses. Leaders fear losing face more than losing righteousness. They fear criticism more than corruption. And they fear accountability because they have built their power on privilege rather than principle. But Umar slept on the ground while ruling an empire because he knew that comfort dulls conscience, and that leadership detached from the suffering of the people becomes tyranny, even if it wears the language of democracy. And I reflect on this not as nostalgia, but as a warning, because history does not repeat itself out of romance, it repeats itself out of negligence. And when leaders forget the moral foundations of authority, societies decay from the top down. And today the world is burning not because of lack of intelligence or resources, but because leadership has been severed from moral responsibility. And Umar taught us that justice is not selective, that law must apply to the ruler before the ruled, and that the leader is not above accountability but beneath it, carrying its weight like a burden that bends the spine. And when I stand today as a leader, I do not ask what benefits me. I ask what history will say when my power is gone, when my name is no longer announced, when all that remains is my record, because Umar ruled knowing he would be questioned, and that consciousness is what separated him from tyrants. Because he did not rule to be remembered, he ruled to answer, and this is where modern leadership must return if humanity is to survive its own arrogance. Because technology has advanced, but ethics have regressed, and power today moves faster than wisdom. Decisions are made without reflection, wars are launched without accountability, economies are manipulated without mercy, and leaders hide behind institutions to escape personal responsibility. But Umar stood alone before Allah even while leading millions, and that solitude before God is what purified his leadership, because a leader who does not fear Allah will always fear people, polls, media, rivals, and legacy. But a leader who fears Allah fears nothing else, and that fear produces courage. The courage to speak truth, to reject injustice, to admit mistakes, and to walk away from comfort when conscience demands sacrifice. And this is why Umar's leadership still speaks to us today. Because it was not bound by time, it was bound by principles that do not expire. And the tragedy of our age is not lack of examples, but lack of willingness to learn from them, because Umar's life stands as an accusation against every leader who rules for self-preservation rather than service. And as I reflect on my own responsibility, I know that leadership is not about control, it is about stewardship, not about domination, but protection, not about privilege, but sacrifice. And history does not forgive leaders who betray trust. It only records them as warnings for future generations. Because history is ruthless with leaders who confuse authority with entitlement. And I remind myself every day that the chair I occupy is temporary, but the consequences of my decisions are permanent. That Umar ibn al-Khattab did not govern with slogans but with sleepless nights. That he did not ask how history would praise him but how Allah would judge him. And this is the fracture line between yesterday and today. Because modern leadership has mastered communication but forgotten character, mastered optics but abandoned one obligation, and the result is a world where promises are loud, but principles are silent, where nations collapse, not from external enemies, but from internal betrayal of trust. And when I read about Omar walking in the darkness, carrying food on his own back to a hungry household, I am reminded that leadership is not delegation of compassion, it is embodiment of it, that systems matter, but conscience matters more, because systems without conscience become instruments of cruelty, and conscience without courage becomes useless, and Umar had both. And that balance is rare, because courage without conscience creates tyrants, and conscience without courage creates spectators. But leadership demands the fusion of both, and this is why Umar could remove governors without hesitation when injustice appeared, even if they were powerful, even if they were close to him, because loyalty to justice came before loyalty to people. And today the tragedy is that leaders protect allies instead of principles. They excuse corruption in their own camp while condemning it in others, and that selective morality erodes legitimacy faster than any rebellion. Because people can endure hardship, but they cannot endure hypocrisy. And Omar understood this truth instinctively, because he knew that trust once broken is almost impossible to restore, and this is why he lived simply. Because extravagance in leadership is not a private matter. It is a public signal. It tells the people whether their suffering is seen or ignored. And when leaders live above the pain of the masses, their words about sacrifice become insults. And their calls for patience become mockery. And history shows us again and again that revolutions do not begin with hunger alone. They begin with humiliation, when people feel unseen, unheard, and unvalued. And Omar prevented this not through propaganda but through proximity, through presence, through listening, and through justice that did not ask for status before acting. And as I look at today's world, I see leadership obsessed with security but blind to legitimacy, obsessed with control but fearful of truth, because truth threatens systems built on convenience rather than conviction. And yet Omar welcomed truth even when it wounded his pride, because pride had no sanctuary in his heart, and this is perhaps the most dangerous disease of modern leadership. Ego institutionalized, arrogance protected by power, and self-interest disguised as national interest. And when leaders speak of the people while separating themselves from the people, decay becomes inevitable. And I say this not as a sermon to others, but as a warning to myself. Because leadership does not corrupt suddenly, it erodes slowly, it whispers compromises, it normalizes injustice in small doses until the extraordinary becomes ordinary. And Umar guarded himself against this erosion. Through constant self-accountability, through remembering death, through remembering that every decision would be weighed, not negotiated, not justified by circumstances, but judged by intention and impact, and that awareness restrained him more effectively than any constitution, because laws can be bent, but conscience either stands or collapses. And Umar's conscience stood firm, and this firmness created stability, because people will accept even strict leadership if it is just, but they will rebel against even soft leadership if it is dishonest. And this is the paradox modern leaders refuse to accept, because they chase popularity instead of legitimacy, applause instead of trust, and visibility instead of virtue. And Omar's life exposes that emptiness, because his authority did not come from fear, it came from credibility, and credibility is built when words and actions align consistently over time. And this alignment is exhausting. It demands sacrifice, restraint, and humility. And many leaders choose comfort over consistency, but history rewards the latter and buries the former under forgotten names. And when I consider the future, I know that nations do not rise or fall by chance. They rise when leadership is anchored in justice, and fall when leadership becomes transactional. And Umar's era was not perfect, but it was principled. And principles give societies resilience, because they provide moral direction when circumstances change. And without that direction, power becomes reactive, impulsive, and destructive. And today the world suffers from leadership that reacts instead of reflects, that escalates instead of restrains, that dominates instead of serves. And the lesson from Omar to today is brutally simple yet profoundly difficult. Leadership is not about how much power you hold, but how much injustice you prevent. Not about how long you rule, but how fairly you govern. Not about how strong you appear, but how accountable you remain. And until modern leadership rediscovers this truth, history will continue to repeat its harshest chapters, because history is not impressed by progress without morality. And I know that if I fail to learn from Umar ibn al-Khattab, then I am not a leader advancing the future. I am merely repeating the mistakes of the past. And that realization weighs heavily on me, because leadership that ignores history is leadership destined to harm its own people. And Umar ibn al-Khattab stands in history not as a myth, but as a mirror, reflecting what leadership looks like when it is stripped of vanity and anchored in responsibility. And I often think about how Omar welcomed criticism as a safeguard rather than a threat, because he understood that unchecked power slowly convinces a leader that he is infallible, and the moment a leader believes he cannot be wrong, injustice becomes inevitable. And this is why Omar placed himself among the people rather than above them, because distance breeds distortion, and distortion breeds cruelty. And today, leadership often hides behind gates, protocols, and layers of authority, forgetting that the purpose of leadership is not insulation but connection, not separation but service. And when leaders become unreachable, suffering becomes invisible. And when suffering becomes invisible, injustice becomes policy. And Omar prevented this by remaining accessible, by listening even when the truth was uncomfortable, by accepting correction even when it challenged his authority, because he knew authority without humility is tyranny in disguise, and humility without action is weakness. And leadership demands both strength and submission to justice, to truth, and ultimately to Allah. And this balance is rare because it requires constant self-discipline, constant self-questioning, and constant remembrance that power is fleeting. And I remind myself